Okay.
Then I am officially recording this technical challenged. It's really funny. This is the first Focus Friday that we've been able to hold in person since January of 2020. And before we ever, in January 2020, I never heard the word Zoom. I didn't even know what that was. And so all of the Focus Fridays that we've held since COVID have all been on Zoom until today. And then the first time we tried to Zoom a Focus Friday, although we've Zoomed dozens and dozens of programs, this one had an issue. But welcome to our Focus Friday with Dana Simpson. Before we go into the introduction of our speaker, I want to call on Luke McDonald from Novant Health, Huntersville Medical Center, to give an update. Novant is the presenting sponsor of our Focus Friday. Luke, share a little bit about what's going on at Novant.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. I don't have a ton to update, but there's a couple things I'd like to call out and actually thank. I see Commissioners Powell and Altman. Earlier this week, we were able to, with the county commissioners, get a proclamation for prematurity awareness. At the board meeting, we had a team member go there to make a few remarks just to bring awareness to women's and children's health. So thanks to the county commissioners for that. Also, specifically for Huntersville, many of you may have seen or maybe not, Leapfrog just came out with their report. Leapfrog is a nonprofit organization that focuses on hospital safety, and Novant Health Huntersville Medical Center received an A grade. So really proud of that, and it's good to have a top level facility in the community there. With that, thanks for having us. Always happy to sponsor and be here, and look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Luke. I appreciate that. And I was congratulating earlier, Elaine Powell has been reelected as our Mecklenburg County District 1 County Commissioner. And Elaine, thank you for joining us. And I'm sure Jeff's probably going to have you on next year to talk about what's going on with Mecklenburg County. But what I'd like to do, Jeff, I'll continue letting people in as they come on. But I want to recognize Jeff Tarte, who is our 2022 Public Policy Chair, and has been named the incoming chamber chair for 2024. Douglas Marion, we're actually having a board retreat today to discuss the 2023 year, but Jeff will be coming on as our chairman of the Chamber of Commerce in 2024. But Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can introduce our speaker and then facilitate some questions.
All right, we'll open this up a little bit here. Dana and I have actually worked together for over a decade. He's recognized as one of the elite attorneys in the state of North Carolina, working for, I think he said it's the largest law firm operating out of a single office out of Raleigh, Smith Andersen, who is well regarded in a lot of topics, full service law firm. Double Tar Hill, I believe.
Indeed.
Correct? Undergrad.
Very much so.
Go Hills, right?
That's right.
Both undergrad and your law degree is, which a lot of people don't recognize. I think there's over like 700 registered lobbyists in the state of North Carolina that work both with the federal and the state legislatures. And Dana is consistently ranked as the top lobbyist in the state. It's an amazing distinction because there are a ton of talented people that work in that profession. And for you to be recognized by your peers, by other legislators and stuff, it's an amazing honor. And we're happy to have you here. Now, again, we're going to have a little technical fun, but I think we are the two that can do this without notes and stuff. And what I wanted to have Dana take some time is maybe some opening comments, anything you want to share, and then we're just going to get into a dialogue conversation. I'm going to do my best Charlie Rose of PBS fame, and we're just going to banter about what's going on in politics and elections, what's going on in Raleigh, et cetera. So
sounds great. Well, it's great to be here today with everybody, and certainly my friend Jeff Tarte, and we've had a good time working together when you were in the Senate. And I'll just say, Lake Norman has brought great elected officials to Raleigh, and being able to team up with your state House member Tom Tillis, now our U.S. Senator. Sally Ashworth and I have worked together a long time on tourism policy issues. You've got absolutely one of the best tourism leaders in the state of North Carolina. She is a gem and a leader among her peers, and I've had a chance to work with her for years. But it's fun for me being back here So I'm actually, while I'm not from Mecklenburg County in terms of roots, my family, I'm the first Simpson raised outside of Iredell County since about the beginning of the 1800s. My mom grew up on a dairy farm that's now underneath Lake Norman, and my dad's from Troutman. So I feel very much rooted in this area, even though I grew up in Asheboro. So it's good to be back home within the family perspective, and looking forward to the conversation today.
All right, well, let's just jump into it, because I'm curious your perspective. We just finished the midterm elections, and what's your thoughts and takeaways?
I mean, I think probably from each party, sometimes for lawyers, when you end up in a mediation, you had a good mediated result when all the parties leave a little bit unhappy. And I think that's kind of what happened with the elections on last Tuesday. I think for Republicans, the state of North Carolina was a bright spot. They ran the tables in the U.S. Senate race and the two statewide state Supreme Court races that they cared about. And they were able to pick up a supermajority in the state Senate and one vote shy of the supermajority in the state House. So they had a really good night in North Carolina. But there were also some bright spots for Democrats in North Carolina. They went in, if you think about our congressional races, heading into this year's election, we had 13 congressional seats currently. 9 were Republican, 4 were Democratic. We added a congressional seat because of redistricting. And at the end of the day, there's 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans in North Carolina. So that's really a function of maps being redrawn by the state Supreme Court, which probably would have ended up at least a 10-4 majority for Republicans, but for that redraw. Instead, it's 7-7. I can assure you that Speaker McCarthy or Speaker-elect McCarthy would have liked to have those extra 3 seats. So really, we're going to have a really competitive U.S. House this year because of North Carolina. And you've got a really interesting congressional delegation. 5 new members of the congressional delegation, all are former colleagues of Senator Tarte. They're all state senators that have entered Congress for North Carolina.
That must be the try. That's how you
clearly it's top notch. Got to go through this. Well, I think Senator Tillis would say the House works too, but you guys could have that debate.
Sneak one in.
You could have that debate. But I think Democrats nationally feel really good. It wasn't a red wave, and they had a lot of success. And my takeaway really is candidate quality matters. And in North Carolina, people were talking about Ted Budd's race being boring, but it kind of came across as a generic race on the economy. And as a result of being boring, he won.
You think that's being able to, because one of the things I heard about Ted's race was staying on message. How important is that for candidates?
Incredibly important. He was disciplined. He was on message. He was talking about things that voters care about for the future, not looking backwards on the 2020 elections. I think if you see where Republican candidates failed across the country, it was kind of a retrospective view of relitigating the 2020 presidential election and getting too tied into those issues versus talking about pocketbook issues that are impacting families like inflation, like crime. The Republican candidates that focused on that won, and those that were focused on relitigating some of the things that former President Trump wanted to relitigate were not a success.
Well, since you mentioned him first, what was the Trump effect on this election?
I think he was very effective in Republican primaries and still has a lot of influence with Republican voters. And you saw that in lots of U.S. Senate seats across the country. I think at the same time, he struggles getting support from independents and loses some moderate Republican votes. And I think we saw that as well. I don't think his candidates that he helped win in the primaries, frankly, Ted Budd is the exception to the rule in terms of having a good night after being endorsed by President Trump compared to what happened in Pennsylvania or Arizona and some of those other states. So it was interesting to see
argument that Ted leveraged the endorsement during the primary to separate himself from the Republicans. And I don't see him that he leaned as heavily into it for the general, kind of stayed away from it and just ran on his own record.
I agree. And he had a record to run on. I think that's really important. Ted Budd had a congressional record to run on. He had been a proven candidate and a proven member of Congress, whereas you look at some of the Trump endorsed candidates in other states, whether it was Herschel Walker, whether it was Dr. Oz, or out in Arizona with Blake Masters, they did not have proven records in terms of public service. And so there's a difference there.
So on the election, you talk about caliber of the candidates, the quality, but how much are we seeing and what impact are people's just voting party? Any?
Increasingly in North Carolina, heard a interesting, since he's your former state house member, really interesting conversation last Thursday at Chapel Hill. And I do bleed a little light blue. I'm the immediate past president of the Alumni Association of Carolina. So I was proud that this was on campus. They have a program for public discourse, which is really trying to create conversations where people can disagree on policy without being disagreeable. And they hosted a conversation with Senator Tillis and Cal Cunningham. So his opponent in 2020 in what was the most expensive US Senate race in American history. And it was a conversation about how friendships can actually develop where you disagree on policy. And they talked about how they developed a rapport during the debates. And they promised each other that, hey, whoever wins has to take the other one out to eat afterwards. And they did that at a little country restaurant called Big Ed's in Raleigh. And since then, they developed a friendship. And Senator Tillis has leaned on Cal on a couple issues. And they were talking about friendships that would be, in spite of differences. And part of that conversation, both of them made the point that and this goes to your question, 20 years ago in North Carolina, about 20% of the electorate would move back and forth across parties. That has shrunk now to about between 6 and 8%. And so a lot more is about generating your base turnout, getting your voters to the polls. And then there's really only about a 6 to 8% part of the electorate that's willing to move. And people always ask, well, how's that the case? Because now we have more unaffiliated voters in North Carolina than we have Democrats or Republicans. So why don't we have more that are willing to do it? A lot of people are registered unaffiliated, but they're really not that unaffiliated. So about 40% of unaffiliateds really are Republicans and they vote Republican. The other 40% are really Democrats and they vote Democrat. It's that 20% of unaffiliated, which makes up about 8% of overall voters that are willing to swing. So it's a smaller group. That's why you see North Carolina elections, the blowout in the US Senate this year was almost 4%. Senator Tillis won by 1.5%. So you're not going to see big blowouts in North Carolina elections in the future just because the number of people willing to move back and forth is a much smaller number than in the past.
It'd be interesting in your perspective, because one of the things you hear about unaffiliated voters in particular, they tend to be single issue or 1 or 2 issue voters versus a whole philosophy or a point of view on a spectrum of things. Does that bear out, or do you?
I don't know. I haven't seen enough data analytics on that. I'm sure some of our political consultants could get into the details. I do think there are some that are broader based voters that just don't want to identify with a party per se, but vote. You can see one of the things, I don't know if you should do it or not, but you can actually check out your neighbors if you want to. You can go on the State Board of Elections website and pull somebody up and you can figure out how they vote, even if they're unaffiliated in primaries. And if you see somebody has voted in a particular primary for a long period of time, they're probably generally in that camp. Because if you vote in all those primaries, you probably vote that way. So some of them are like that, and some of them are single issue voters. And we saw some single issue play out this year in campaigns. Abortion was a big issue that Democrats focused on. And some people, it was crime in certain areas that Republicans focused on. So in addition to inflation.
Well, one of the things you hear about North Carolina, we get categorized as a purple state, being, split about, maybe talk to that. But I would describe it more, we're a striped state. We're not purple, we're striped, in that there's pockets of pure red, pockets of pure blue, and it's not really commingled. Can you speak to that?
That's a great point, Jeff. I think we're polka dots, and it's like we're like a red animal with some blue polka dots. And if you look, it's a fascinating map. If you look at, I think if you're looking for like a generic candidate, a generic Democrat and a generic Republican, look at the state Supreme Court races, right? Because they didn't have enough money to really create their own identities that much. If you look at those races, 82 counties voted Republican out of 100. 18 counties voted Democrat. But those Republicans only won by about 4.5% of the vote. So your urban, densely populated counties brought 48% of the vote in the state, but there were only 18 of them. It's your Mecklenburg. So I looked at the numbers. Wake County and Mecklenburg County, very similarly, each gave margin of victory for the Democratic Supreme Court candidates by 100,000 votes. So just coming out of those two counties, the Democratic candidates for Supreme Court started with the 200,000 vote edge. So it took a collect, and then you have Forsyth and Guilford and Durham and Orange. New Hanover's more swing, Bunker, sure. But and then a little bit in the Northeast, and that's kind of it. So we're very concentrated Democratic vote, spread out Republican vote, and I think part of what you see both parties doing is recognition for Democrats. They've got to shrink the margins in the suburban counties, the Unions, the Cabarrus, the Iredell, the Gaston, the Johnston, outside of they've got to, those are red, but how do you shrink them? Some of that's happened in Cabarrus. Cabarrus is one of those traditionally red counties that's becoming a little more purple. But that's their focus for the future of how do you narrow those suburban county margins. And for Republicans, they've got to maintain a presence in your urban areas, because at the end of the day, while you may not have Republicans winning countywide offices in Mecklenburg and Wake. I mean, interesting, when I got into politics 25 years ago, probably 40%, 50% of the Mecklenburg legislative delegation was Republican.
We were split
that's
when
not,
I was in.
That's, you have
half and half.
How that's changed is you have one little red dot in the House in Mecklenburg, and the same thing, there's one House member
and 16 other Democratic members
and Mecklenburg, and one Republican House member in Wake, and that's just changed fundamentally through the years. Now, from a Lake Norman perspective, it's really good because in terms of having somebody who's going to have influence, because John Bradford is the chair of the Finance Committee. He's going to be in the majority party. So as it relates to tax policy, as it relates to appropriations, I know he focused a lot. I think he did a lot as it related to Huntersville, Cornelius, and Davidson in appropriations last year. He'll still be back in that position.
Vicky Sawyer.
And then on you're getting Iredell County's Vicky Sawyer for the first time, now representing Northern Mac, which I think is going to be, since transportation's always been a huge issue here, you now have the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, and she's really been a champion. She did something I didn't think we'd ever see last term, and really led an effort to take a percentage of the state sales tax that goes to the state and allocate it to the transportation, our highway trust fund. And now it's going to increase over the next 4 years from 2% to 6%, but that's hundreds of millions of dollars. So it'll end up being about $600 million in additional funding for transportation, because the sales tax is now earmarked for that, which is going to mean some of your projects from an SDI perspective that were getting bumped off the list will now be back on the list. So you're going to have, from a Lake Norman perspective, in Northern Mecklenburg County, you're going to have the chair of transportation and the Senate helping you on those issues and focused on that. You're going to have the chair of the Finance Committee, the Tax Policy Committee, in the House. So you're going to be in a really good spot.
And we claim one other person because he touches us on the border, which is Jason Sane.
Absolutely, Lincoln County's finest. So
and speak to Jason's role.
So
I may not know.
So Representative Sane represents Lincoln County right here, and a big chunk of Lake Norman as well. And he is the senior chair of appropriations in the House, which means he's in charge of the almost $30 billion state budget. So that's always good to have a friend next door who is thinking about your regional issues from a budgetary perspective. So I know you guys are close friends and have done IT policy and other policy issues together for a long time. So you'll be able to have that kind of dialogue from a chamber perspective.
Get some technical skills that can help with Zoom.
That's right. He would. I'm sure his company would be glad to contract with the chamber.
The shifting a little bit, but staying on the governance structure, particularly. Let's focus on the General Assembly, as that impacts us a lot. This one I'm obviously a little more familiar. with when I was in, we had a couple terms where we were in super majorities. I'm actually not a big fan because it quells and almost silences the voice of the other side. We have super majority going forward in the Senate. We have only one vote short in the House. How do you see the dynamics and the governance structure between the chambers? Because that's always been, people may not recognize the challenge. When Senator Apodaca was the rules chair and he took me around the hallways, the very first thing, it was kind of paraphrasing. We were walking and the building's symmetrical. So one half is the Senate, the other half, when you cross through a kind of the hallway, you end up in the House side. And as we were walking, he was describing the relationship between the Republicans and the Democrats, to realize that the Democrats were really our opposition in a way to a lot of things. But then when we crossed into the House, referring to all the House members, Republicans and Democrats, he goes, they're the enemy.
That's exactly right.
But the sense is, if the Senate can the Republicans can do, in a sense, whatever they want. That's kind of a loose way to phrase it. The House won't be able to do that. And then what influence will the governor have, and how much time will he spend lobbying, if you will, the House members to keep them in line?
Well, that started the day after the election, because I know he was making phone calls to a number of House Democrats. I do think it's interesting, what it will probably mean. And somebody has, some political observers have described North Carolina from a business perspective is in the Goldilocks position of states, which is a Republican-led legislature that has driven pro-business tax policies, regulatory policies, liability policies, but without a veto-proof supermajority. So some of the social policies that have created more controversy in a Texas or a Florida have not come to bear since we dealt with House Bill 2. And I think a lot of people felt like after that, we don't want to touch that rail again in North Carolina. The question is going to be, what does that one vote short of a supermajority mean in the House? I think Republicans in the Senate will be able to really govern the way they want to, as long as they can keep their caucus together. I think Speaker Moore has proven his ability to work with moderate Democrats across party lines on things like the budget and on business issues. But I think it will put some limits on some of the social policy issues that will be able to be passed. And some from the business community may say that's perfect, right? We'll be able to get some business issues accomplished, but maybe not have some of the high profile social issue fights. I still think I think the issue of abortion will be debated. And we'll see how that plays out. I think the ability to go to restrictive kind of policy that some other southern states have done is going to be really difficult to get accomplished without that supermajority. And even with the supermajority, I'm not sure that there were all the leadership wanted to do that. But overall, I think you're going to come back with known leadership. You know what Senator Phil Berger wants to do. You know what Speaker Tim Moore wants to do. People won't realize that Senator Berger is going to be heading into his 7th term, almost the second longest serving pro tem of the state Senate in state history. Speaker Moore, when he takes the gavel in January, will be the longest serving speaker we've ever had. So we kind of know what the leadership is going to do, what they're going to work on. They care about tax policy. It's interesting. So when this current Republican majority took control of the General Assembly in 2010, North Carolina had the highest personal income tax rate in the Southeast. And we had the highest corporate income tax in the Southeast. And today they have lowered the individual income tax from a high, which was 7.75 for high income earners, down to now 4.99. And that's going to be reduced further over the next several years to below 4%. And we've moved the corporate tax from almost 7 to 2.5, which is the lowest corporate income tax rate in the country that has a corporate income tax. And that's going to get phased out over the next 6-7 years to 0.
And because when I went in Tax Foundation, which is a bipartisan think tank that ranks based on tax policies on a whole host of things, we were like 44th in the country, and we were 8th now or something.
Yeah, we're top 10 now. And as those phase in, they've said when if they were phased in already, we'd be 5th.
Which is why
And
we were
so-
ranked by Forbes, I believe, #1 for business
We
climate.
got Forbes and CNBC, and so to be #1 in the country for business environment right now. So you've got our incredible university and community college system that does workforce training better than any other community college system in America. That is, in terms of, we all know that workforce issues are top priority for all businesses right now. Continue to double down into investments and in your higher education system, I think, along with keeping a regulatory and a tax environment. Senator Berger in a press conference the day after the election said he wants to continue to lean into tax policy to make sure we really are the most competitive. So I think you could see some discussion about additional income tax reduction, and then
Sure.
what does it look like as it relates to the budget. So it's finding that balance between making sure you have enough to invest in your higher education system and K-12 while also keeping that competitive tax structure.
I'm thinking about Senator Manchin, his role at the federal level, kind of being the voice that can swing votes. Curious if you have any insight perspective on, with the one member, it only takes one to jump across on a veto or a key bill. Who are the 2 or 3 Democratic House members we should keep an eye on over the next year or two to say, these are the people, depending how they vote, we'll see legislation pass?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of folks that are able to work across party lines. There's some that have proven it in the past. Representative Michael Ray is a Democrat from Northampton County who is very
Who was there when I was
close
there,
with the
so I
business
know him.
community. Representative Shelley Willingham from Eastern North Carolina is a Democrat as well. But you've got folks here in Mecklenburg County that have been able to work across party lines. I know she's returning to the General Assembly, but Tricia Cotham has always been very effective and in terms of building relationships across party lines. Becky Carney's done that in the past. So not that there'd be I don't necessarily see them on a high profile social issue,
Sure.
but on budget issues or business issues, you certainly have members in Mecklenburg County that have proven willing to find common ground.
Okay, I'm gonna kind of shift gears on you a little bit and talk about your profession,
Sure.
being a lobbyist. And it's like, I'm not sure which gets lower ratings, you guys or the elected officials sometimes.
Well,
But speak to what the role of a lobbyist is as you
Sure.
see it.
As a lawyer and a lobbyist, I don't tell my mom I'm doing both of those, right? So if I could just own a used car lot, I would have a hit for the trifecta in terms of professions that people have questions about. This is not something you necessarily grow up thinking that you're going to become.
So when you were in 3rd grade, they said, what do you want to be? Fireman? I want to be a teacher. No, I want to be a
That
lobbyist.
didn't come up. But I've always loved public policy. So I interned in the House of Representatives as a senior at Chapel Hill, and then was fortunate enough to end up being asked to take on a staff position in the Speaker's office for a couple of years before I went back to law school. So I really enjoyed watching people make a difference. I love the state level. I got a chance to work a little bit in DC, but the state level, people are in it to make a difference. You don't run for elected office, as you know, Jeff, for the glory at the state level, because you make $13,000 a year in a job that feels like it's a full-time job, even though it's supposed to be a part-time.
About 60 hours a week.
So the people you get to work with are in it to make a difference for their communities. They're not in it for the glory, because there's not a lot that comes with it. And so I really got to see that with working with good people. Went back to law school, tried to be a real lawyer for a while. I'm a recovering corporate healthcare attorney. And so I did practice corporate health law for a period of time after law school, and then got pulled in by some healthcare clients that said, hey, the General Assembly, and you used to work there in the Speaker, our issues. Would you help kind of educate the folks that about the complexities of these issues? So I found myself pulled back in the 2000s, even though my background is I'd worked for a Republican Speaker of the House, and it was all Democrats. But what I love about North Carolina, you go to DC with lobbyists, you have people who specialize in either one department in the federal government or one chamber like the U.S. House or the U.S. or in one party. Or I even laugh, some people subspecialize on like Republican senators west of the Mississippi. I mean, it's that kind of subspecialization. Whereas in North Carolina, you need to be able to work with everybody. And so I was able to work with the Democratic governor and Democratic legislature because you could become a subject matter expert. And for me, it was healthcare to start with. And work in that and be effective, because our job, I realized, lobbyists are really educators. And our job is, as you know, senators and House members are dealing with thousands of bills each session. And you are, unlike a member of Congress, you don't have a staff of 8 or 9 to do independent research for you. You have
A receptionist,
a
legislative
legislative assistant that's going to do all your constituent work, scheduling, and you're having to figure out on your own these policy issues. And so really the role of a lobbyist, if they're doing their job correctly, is to give you information so that you can make an informed decision. And what I think we try to do is give you both sides of the story if you're trying to do it correctly so nobody's surprised. I will come in and talk with a member of, this is an issue I'm working on for a client. Here's why I think it's the right policy issue. Here's what you're going to hear from someone else. They're going to tell you it's wrong, and you're going to probably hear this. Here's why I think that's wrong. But you give them the whole picture of what's going on so they're not surprised as they deal with issues. But I really look at it as a matter of taking complex issues, being able to distill it and educate. And then as lawyers, like a litigator becomes an expert in civil procedure and the rules of evidence and how to work in a courtroom, a lobbyist becomes an expert not only in educating on specific subject matter, but the legislative process of how does a bill become a law outside of the old TV. I'm just a bill that we all watch.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of other moving parts.
School.
How do you Schoolhouse Rocks? How do you really help get a bill passed? Or if your client doesn't like a piece of legislation that's moving, how do you help
Stop
it? And so we are both educators as well as knowledgeable about that process and how to move something through or how to get it to
And
stop.
I've always said, people asked about it. A lobbyist is a role that, like any profession or elected officials, there's, they're a necessary component. You can't, legislators cannot get their job done without, but there's really great ones, there's good ones, and then there's some bad ones that just don't know their work, right? Because they don't do their homework. But it has always been that, how do I educate and share? And the better lobbyists, as you described, Dana, have the ability to share what are the issues on both sides of the coin. So then you can obviously make your own decision as a legislator where you fall on those things. Talk about, because it seems to me one really important aspect for a lobbyist to be effective, for a legislator to be effective, to navigate learning fiscal research people in those departments. Used to be PED, no longer. But so how important are relationships?
Oh, relationships are important. The more you know about someone, you're going to understand issues and how they'll affect their districts, how their professional background. So, for instance, when I got to meet Senator Tarte, knowing his background from an IT perspective, expertise, and healthcare expertise, I knew if I could bring a healthcare issue to him, he would immediately understand it, get it, could distill it, and could educate others. You work with legislators to understand, you build those relationships, and the more I understand about your background, your business, your expertise, knowing what issues you may be interested in because of that. And those relationships, then over time, you build trust. And I think that's important over time. It's hard for you all. You have so much information coming at you from so many resources. I think from a lobbyist perspective, the currency of the realm is trust, that I'm going to work with members on lots of issues. And if I ever give you bad information, you're not going to trust me again.
Right.
And I'm not going to be able to be effective. And so I need to be able to give you the good, bad, and the ugly and let you make an informed decision. But those relationships over time, if you've worked with someone for several years, okay, I can take their information to the bank and I can make an informed decision on that. So I do think relationships matter. I think understanding those pieces and how everybody works together and their professional backgrounds, because it really is a citizen legislature. I love the fact that you've got all these people with different backgrounds that are coming together. You got farmers and attorneys and doctors and business folks all trying to figure out how to move North Carolina forward, and they bring their own individualized expertise to the table. And if you understand where that is, you can help try to navigate good policy through it.
And talk a little bit about navigating and passing a bill, since you brought that up. And the state legislature, particularly in the Senate and the House, function fairly differently. One is you've only got 50 people in one in the Senate, 120 in the House. The Senate tend to be a very tight caucus by party. On our side of the aisle, the Republican, very tightly controlled. But a lot of people don't realize, I remember like the second time going to Florida to vote and hearing the Sergeant of Arms going, well, I wonder how this bill, what the final vote will be. And it's like, I already know, because we always voted in caucus and nothing was allowed to go to the floor that didn't have the outcome as the majority desired. And you talk about trust. So it was the expectation we would whip votes, if you will, or count votes in the caucus. And if you disagree, you were going to vote different than the majority, that was okay, but they wanted to know where you're going to vote. So to vote differently on the floor than what you communicated violates that trust. Absolutely. Curious from your perspective, obviously we're counting votes. Do lobbyists go through the process when they're trying to work and help a client navigate? How do you go about, for lack of a better term, whipping votes to know what's coming?
You learn to count votes early on to do this job. And, it is different between the chambers, because you want to have, what you mentioned is very true. For in the Senate, and this was the case when it was Democratic controlled, as the case was Republican controlled, a lot's decided in that majority caucus meeting. And you better have your votes either for or against going into the caucus, because once people leave, they really try to, okay, we're going to have this issue. I'll tell you if I'm voting against it or why it should come to the floor or not, but they try to all stick together once they leave that caucus. Even if I didn't like it, I'll generally vote for it if it's a caucus issue. You don't see splits in the Senate Republican caucus nearly as much as you do on the House side. And it's because it's only 50 and you've got a smaller caucus, they stick together. So we need to have, going in, if you want to build a pass, a majority of the Republican caucus. There's only one or two times I can remember in the last 12 years that a bill came to the floor that didn't have a majority of the caucus's votes with it. Actually, one of the issues this past year is it related to sports betting. It's one of the few times that actually a minority of the Senate Republicans voted for something. So that was a rare instance. The House is just a different beast. It's just kind of wide open. And there's there's 120 members, and trying to keep them all in a caucus lockstep. They do a good job of that, but it's still, you've got some frogs that jump out of the wheelbarrow all the time, and it is just, and that's been the same institutionally for 25 years. It's just more people, they're going to be independent folks. So you want to have your votes going to the caucus, but you better also have your votes headed to the floor. And again, the sports betting bill was an interesting bill to watch this year. I wasn't involved, so I got to be an observer. That was one that came out with a majority out of the House Republican caucus, but somebody did not have all their votes tied up, and they thought they had votes on the House floor that they did not. And whoever was doing the vote counting from the lobbying perspective didn't get them all right, because they were counting on more Democratic votes than they had. And as a result, the bill failed on the floor. You don't see high profile votes fail on the floor very often, because people have learned to count, both leadership wise and the people who are pushing the bill. You never want to put your members out there on an issue and have a vote fail. But, sometimes people will tell you one thing and it's something else. So from a member perspective, I always tell members, like, you vote against the issue all day long. Just tell me where you are. Right? Because I don't want to ever have a bill run that I think the votes are there and they're not. And so we've worked on some really close votes through the years, and you double and triple check, and you learn, there's a difference when a lobbyist comes to us to you saying, I'll consider it, versus I'm for it. And you file those away. You learn the language of a member. I'm considering it. I'm thinking about it. I'm not going to count that as a check. I'm going to count that as a maybe or a no.
It's sort of all like counting constituents after an election. And there's, say you have 64,000 residents and they all didn't vote, but you get 74,000 people said they voted for you.
That's exactly right.
Being on the winning side. Now, the other inside baseball that people may not realize, and you guys may know this on the lobbyist side, but we would actually in the caucus, if we had a clear majority of the caucus and we were going to carry a vote by 10 or 12 votes, we would always check and say, is there a member that needs to vote against this? When we're all voting for something, are there members because of their constituent or district, or they had a client and say, okay, you can vote. Not that you can vote, you do whatever you want, but nobody's going to hold it against you as a scorecard if you vote against what everybody else is doing, because we recognize you need to protect yourself and your district. That goes on. And I don't think a lot of people realize that as a fact. So kind of shifting now, we're, past this current election, we kind of have a sense of the bodies going forward. What are the big issues that you see are going to get tackled in the coming session?
We talked about taxes already. I think taxes will be up there, and that's something Senator Berger has continued to focus on from a business friendly perspective. I think infrastructure has been something North Carolina's really invested in. Taking
Bridges,
the
roads,
ARPA funds for broadband. We were one of the top states in the country in terms of deploying ARPA funding for broadband. I think that will continue. Water and sewer, really big investments in water and sewer for local governments. We just passed a very unique bipartisan energy bill. We've got a clean energy bill in North Carolina.
What's unique about it?
Oh, it's very few purple states with a red legislature and a blue governor that have passed bipartisan energy legislation in the United States. So it's a big win for Governor Cooper. I think it's a win for bipartisan compromise, and it was really fascinating to watch at the end of the 21 session, the Republican leadership and and Governor Cooper's team whip votes together for this bipartisan, where it was really interesting. If you want to talk about where people come together in the middle that you don't get to hear about on CNBC or Fox or MSNBC and Fox, is you actually had the far right of the Republican Party voting against it because they felt it went too far on clean energy.
Far left.
And the far left said it didn't go far enough and it was too many things in there. And so you had this like 90 out in the House, it was like 90 some votes in the middle. And it was really neat to see. And it was the thing, again, the things you don't get to see after that vote. I got to watch the minority leader, Robert Reeves, and majority leader, John Bell, share stories on the floor about whipping the votes to work together, which you don't always see. And you didn't have some of the far left and the far right agreeing with it. So those things come together. So I think big energy that's playing out at the Utilities Commission right now, but a great bill for the state. And transportation, again, talk about Senator Sawyer. She's going to continue to lead an effort. She's got a group working on it right now about finding additional sources as our gas tax revenue declines. As we go to more electric vehicles and hybrids, our roads have been funded with the gas tax. And so that goes down, your amount of revenue that goes in. So that allocation of the sales tax into transportation was huge. That's something the Senate led. What are the other ways they're going to find to fund that transportation infrastructure? I think those will be big. I think healthcare. I mean, we've been talking about Medicaid expansion for a long time.
Is it getting across this term or not?
I am
crystal ball.
I am cautiously
optimistic. Heard it here first.
I'm cautiously optimistic that this will be the year. It's different. We've never had a year going into a long session where you've had the Republican pro tem and the Republican speaker say we're for a Medicaid expansion concept, because that just happened last year. And they weren't able to agree on the specifics because of some things that the Senate would like to add in addition to Medicaid expansion, certificate of need, and some of those issues. The House is less interested in doing that. They're taking more of the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. We'll do it, but let's not blow anything up in the process. So I believe there is a pathway for compromise on some of that. But you also have supermajorities now, and you have a number of Republicans, particularly in the House, that don't want to do Medicaid expansion, that think it's a bad issue from an entitlement perspective. And the speaker's got to navigate more no votes. And how do it's going to take a bipartisan team. You won't be able to pass it with Republicans only. It'll take Democrats and Republicans and what else gets added and gets the Senate. It's going to be complicated, but I do think, I'm not saying it's a slam dunk, but I think the chances of finding the right kind of compromise between the Senate and the House and putting the numbers together on the House side is over 50%. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
So just a little wonky for a second. We've seen the leadership at the national federal levels change. Pelosi's no longer going to be speaking, et cetera. At the state level, you mentioned Berger and Moore. Don't anticipate those changing. Are there any key roles below that we'll see new faces or potentially?
You've got all the not really new faces, but maybe some new leadership roles.
That's what I mean.
Senator Kathy Harrington's retired.
Majority leader.
She was the majority leader. I think you'll see your next door neighbor over in Cabarrus, Senator Paul Newton, become the new majority leader. And
big Senate. Role. That's another
big role. Knows this area well. Former president of Duke Energy. And a good double Tar Heel. And so I think he'll be in a new role. I don't see really any leadership changes on the House side at all. Maybe Jason Sane will become conference chair, which kind of deals with elections, but no major changes there. Where I think you'll see the most leadership changes will be in our congressional delegation, because you're going to see, as the Republicans take the House, our more senior Republican members of the North Carolina congressional delegation will have some new roles. Another neighbor, Patrick McHenry and Richard Hudson. So Patrick McHenry, who you all know, Gaston, and then now Hickory and Winston, his district's changed a little bit, but Patrick's going to be the chair of the Financial Services Committee in the United States House of Representatives. That means he's in charge of all banking laws, all financial laws. That's a big deal. So that's a really great spot to have a member of the North Carolina delegation in, particularly with Charlotte being the #2 hub for the financial industry in the East Coast. So that's big. Richard Hudson was just elected last week, who from Cabarrus County, his district's kind of morphed a little bit further east, but Richard is now going to be the chair of the National Republican Congressional Committee, the NRCC, which is responsible for all campaign things for House Republicans. That makes him #4 in the House leadership, behind the Speaker, the Majority Leader, the Whip, and then it'll be Richard. So that's a big deal. So you're going to have a North Carolinian in all those leadership meetings of what moves forward, what doesn't, within the U.S. House. Those are, I think, Virginia Fox is going to lead a subcommittee on education and pension issues. Dr. Greg Murphy is a member of Congress from Greenville. He is now the one North Carolinian on the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which deals with tax issues. And he's particularly on the Health Subcommittee, which deals with Medicare, Medicaid issues. Big deal for Atrium, Novant, those folks to have somebody. So got a new group of folks coming into different leadership positions. Dan Bishop here is going to be a Judiciary Committee member. And maybe have some subcommittee roles there. I think he'll have a high role on
he's always been recognized as one of the top attorneys in the state.
He is a really smart attorney. I really loved working with him when he was in the Senate. He operated at a really high level from an intellectual perspective.
Last question I have, we're kind of getting close on time, but give us your insights on what you see as 2024 on the governor's race from both sides of if you were looking at guessing.
Yeah, I think right now you've got the two front runners out of the gate would be Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson on the Republican side and Attorney General Josh Stein on the Democratic side. But does that stay there? I don't know. That's a long way away. I think there'll be
any candidates that we're seeing.
There's a lot of talk of whether or not State Treasurer Dale Falwell will get into the governor's race. There's talk of others potentially on the Democratic side. It remains to be seen on how that shakes out. I don't think we know particularly what that looks like. And with Attorney General Stein running, I think that another one to watch is the Attorney General's race,
which is who's.
So a lot of we'll see. I think some people have talked about whether Jeff Jackson, who just won a seat in Congress in Mecklenburg County, would potentially run for Attorney General. I don't know who might end up on the Republican side, but that's actually an interesting race. It's a high-profile statewide race that a Republican has never held since the 1800s. So it'll be interesting when you have an open seat. You never know what will happen. I think it'll be.
And they tend to stay in that office for a while.
Well, if you look at the trajectory, Roy Cooper was able to be attorney. So before Roy Cooper, it was Mike Easley was Attorney General for 8 years.
Prior governor.
Roy Cooper, 16 years.
It's sort of the stepping stone. often.
Josh Stein, it's got 8 years running for governor. So it's a really high profile. You can do a lot for the state. You watch Josh Stein do a lot with the opioid settlement and raise his profile. It's an important office in a lot of ways. And so I think it'll be a really hotly contested statewide race too.
So last thing, and I don't know if they're, Bill, and it'll be a little harder because we're not structured to be able to interact quite the same way, but at least at a minimum, any closing thoughts from your perspective that you'd want to share with everybody? Or
no, I think I've said it. I think Lake Norman is super well represented in the General Assembly with your CVB with Sally Ashworth, and you're fortunate with that. I think it's going to be, I think North Carolina's in a really great spot from an economic development perspective. I think everybody needs to stay focused, and I think they are. Governor Cooper and the legislative leadership of how do we stay #1 place to do business in the country. We've got to lean into that, and then we've got to make sure we're making the investments in infrastructure to sustain that. So, but I think people have their eye on the ball on the most important things.
well, Dana, I appreciate you taking the time to come over this morning, spend time with chamber members. We'll be putting this out on social media as well. We've got almost 1,000 members, so they love to listen to this stuff. And all the political wonks out there like me that like to still follow. And you're on the inside, so that those insights are helpful to share. Appreciate what you do. You're amazing at your job. People respect you literally across the state. So again, thank you for taking time.
Thank you, Jeff. Always great to be here. It's like coming back home.
It's fun to have you here. For everyone, we appreciate your patience and hanging in there, given our technical glitches a little bit. That proves CIOs don't actually do the work. We just ready to get it done. So with that, Bill, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I do appreciate everybody bearing with our challenges. Hopefully over the weekend, I can figure out what's going on with that particular laptop. I want to recognize David Keith. He is on the line. We don't have a December Focus Friday. We never plan one for December. And we're running off today. As soon as this concludes, we have a ribbon cutting in Cornelius and then the Chamber Board retreat to plan the 2023 year. But we have David Keith, our 2022 board chair. David, would you like to say something before we actually sign off?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you everyone for being patient today and dealing with the technical issues. I thought today's conversation was fascinating. I went into college as a political science major, and I didn't stay in that field, but hearing everything today, I would have thoroughly enjoyed it, hearing all the inside stuff that goes on. I kind of figured some stuff went on, but hearing it firsthand was very, very exciting. Also, today will be Douglas Marion, our incoming chamber chair's retreat today. So we're looking forward to that for a few hours to learn what's going to go on with the chamber for next year. And then after that, we are in great hands with Jeff Tarte taking over as well. So thanks everyone for coming today, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I appreciate everybody. I did have a chance to freeze put myself on take myself off the screen and run up and see some of the folks upstairs. So I'm hoping to get upstairs before everybody leaves. But Dana, thank you very much for joining us. Jeff, thank you for emceeing this year's program. Even though he is going to be the incoming chair for 2024, we've tapped him again as the public policy chair. We're like the Godfather, Dana. We just don't let him go.
Good. I wouldn't let him go either.
We keep pulling him back in. Jeff, we've been so blessed to have someone who is a former mayor and a former senator as our public policy chair. And so we are also well represented in Raleigh and in Washington, D.C. But thank everybody for joining us. And we want to thank Novant Health Huntersville Medical Center again for being the presenting sponsor of this program, along with WSIC and Cornelius Today Business Day. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend at the lake.